When a commercial jet makes a flawless emergency landing on an abandoned railway track in the Pyrenees, authorities are left stunned. But this wasn't a crash. It was a calculated extraction. On board was Victor Romano, a wanted Italian gangster fleeing with $90 million in stolen cryptocurrency. And behind the controls, missing pilot Captain Leo Hart, whose silent betrayal would trigger one of the most mysterious multi-vehicle heists in modern history. What followed was a vanishing train car, a burnt-out jet, and a global manhunt with no clear end. This is the story of Bloody Landing, the gangster, the plane, and the track. It was a bright summer morning when Flight JX-1003 lifted off from Berlin International Airport, bound for Madrid. The skies were clear, and the air traffic was smooth. The flight, operated by a well-established European airline, carried 43 passengers and 5 crew members. On the surface, everything seemed routine. The passengers included families on vacation, business travelers, and a few foreign nationals heading home. But hidden among them was one man traveling under a fake identity. Victor Romano, a known gangster with a long criminal record across Italy and parts of Eastern Europe. Authorities believed Romano had been behind a series of complex cybercrimes, including a recent cryptocurrency theft totaling over $90 million. His face had disappeared from the underworld months ago. Now he was quietly slipping out of Europe with a fake passport, using the commercial airline as his escape route. The first sign of something unusual occurred just after the plane crossed into French airspace. Air traffic control in Lyon reported a brief loss of radar contact. For nearly 17 minutes, Flight JX-103 was invisible. The transponder data cut out. Radio contact was silent, and the aircraft vanished from tracking systems. When it finally reappeared, it was flying steadily and on course. The crew made no mention of any technical issues. The pilots claimed they had no knowledge of the blackout. To the control tower, it looked like a minor technical glitch. But behind the scenes, alarm bells were ringing. Radar silence in a commercial flight over European airspace was rare, especially one with no distress signal or mechanical problem. Meanwhile, inside the plane, everything appeared calm. Passengers were served drinks, and the crew carried out their normal duties. Nobody on board seemed to realize that the plane had effectively vanished from European skies for a short window. That window, however, would become the center of an international investigation. Something had happened during those 17 minutes, something invisible to passengers and authorities alike, and no one had any answer. 2 hours after takeoff, just as the flight should have been beginning its descent into Madrid, the plane began to divert. It didn't request an emergency landing. There was no panic, no mayday call. Instead, it silently veered off course, heading toward the remote forested mountains of southern France. Then, in a maneuver that stunned aviation experts, the commercial jet began to descend, slowly, steadily, toward an abandoned stretch of railway track that cut through the hills near the Spanish border. At 10:47 a.m., Flight JX-1003 touched down between 2 pine-covered slopes, landing on iron train tracks that hadn't been in use for over a decade. There were no injuries. The landing was smooth. Emergency services were dispatched, but they arrived to find an intact aircraft, unharmed passengers, and one major mystery: the pilot was missing. Captain Leo Hart, a veteran pilot with over 15 years of experience, was not in the cockpit. His seat was empty. No trace of him was found anywhere on the aircraft. His co-pilot was unconscious, found slumped over in his chair with no memory of what had happened. The flight had landed safely, but the person who had flown it had vanished into thin air. As investigators arrived at the railway landing site, they were met with a baffling scene. The aircraft sat upright on the rusted tracks, its engines shut down and wheels locked in place. Passengers had already been safely evacuated, wandering around in stunned silence, surrounded by the quiet of the mountains. No fire, no smoke, no visible damage. For a moment it didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like a miracle. But that illusion quickly faded. The airline confirmed that the last official communication from the cockpit had come 30 minutes before the landing, when Captain Leo Hart checked in with Madrid Control, stating that everything was normal. However, black box data painted a different picture. Audio recordings revealed a period of complete silence from the flight deck. No communication between the pilots, no procedural checks, nothing. It was as if both pilots had simply stopped talking. Security footage from the internal cockpit camera, which synced automatically with the black box, gave investigators their first real clue. At approximately 10:06 a.m., Captain Hart unbuckled his seatbelt and left his position. Moments later, a man wearing a pilot's uniform, but with no visible airline badge, entered the cockpit. The co-pilot appeared tense, but didn't resist. Shortly after, he slumped forward, motionless. Experts later confirmed he had been drugged, likely through his in-flight drink. The mystery pilot took over the controls alone, guiding the plane down toward the mountains. What baffled authorities further was the precision of the landing. Only an experienced commercial pilot could execute such a maneuver without causing a crash. The aircraft had followed a perfect glide slope onto a narrow, rusting track designed for slow-moving freight trains. It was a landing nobody thought possible, and yet it had been done flawlessly. The man in the cockpit was clearly not just an imposter. He was highly trained, likely military or ex-commercial. The real Captain Hart was nowhere to be found. His name had never been linked to any criminal activity. A father of two with an unblemished flying record, Hart had spent years building his reputation as one of the airline's most reliable pilots. His disappearance didn't make sense. There was no ransom, no message, no political motive. His personal bank accounts remained untouched. No unusual phone activity, no secret travel. It was as he had simply vanished from existence in the middle of a normal flight. As investigators combed through passenger lists and crew logs, they discovered something else, a fake name, flagged under Interpol's watch list. Victor Romano, the Italian fugitive, had boarded the flight using falsified documents. He had booked a seat just 3 hours before departure, paying in cash through a third-party booking agent in Berlin. It was clear now that the landing was no accident. It was part of a coordinated plan, but what that plan truly involved remained hidden. One fact became undeniable. The plane hadn't landed on the tracks because of danger. It had landed there because someone intended it to, and that someone had taken control without anyone realizing it, until it was too late. While investigators scrambled to piece together how a commercial jet had landed on abandoned railway tracks, another discovery shifted the entire focus of the case. 2 hours before Flight JX-3's emergency landing, a privately operated freight train had departed from a secure depot in Toulouse, France. It was carrying an unusual cargo, rare artwork and gold artifacts on loan from the Berlin State Museum, being quietly transported under military-grade security to a temporary exhibit in Andorra. The train's route was classified, running on an old industrial track that was rarely used and completely closed to public access. Yet somehow, the plane had landed directly on that very track at the exact time the train was scheduled to pass through. Satellite images from a weather monitoring satellite confirmed it. Just minutes after the plane touched down, the freight train approached the same stretch of track. What followed was as precise as a choreographed operation. The train slowed down to an unscheduled halt, directly behind the plane. From the aircraft's cargo hold, several men dressed in maintenance uniforms emerged. Security footage from a nearby forest camera caught glimpses of them using a ramp to unload a large, black steel crate. The crate was wheeled across a narrow bridge and placed inside an open freight container at the rear of the train. Strangely, the train's own onboard systems did not report the stop. Its GPS was manually disabled for 15 minutes. Even more suspicious, the container that received the crate had been added just the day before without official documentation. Whoever planned this operation had not only hacked into the flight systems, but had also compromised the private rail network. The scale of coordination was unlike anything law enforcement had seen before. When the train reached its destination the next morning, it was one container short. The last carriage was completely missing. The coupling had been manually disconnected, and the conductor was nowhere to be found. A search began immediately, stretching across the France-Andorra border. Nothing turned up. No debris, no tracks, no sign of forced removal. The missing container had vanished. Experts now believed the plane's landing was not an emergency, but an extraction. The crate, which had been loaded onto the plane before takeoff in Berlin, under the guise of technical equipment, had bypassed standard cargo inspections. Authorities later discovered that 2 airport handlers in Berlin had gone missing the same day the flight took off. Their families reported them as never returning home. The men were later confirmed to be working under aliases, both linked to a smuggling ring based in Palermo, Italy, the same city where Victor Romano had once ruled. Every piece of evidence pointed to a carefully timed transfer of something far more valuable than gold or art. The real question remained unanswered. What was in the crate, and why had so many people risked everything to move it using an airplane and a train in broad daylight? Whatever it was important enough to hijack a flight, steal a train car, and disappear without a trace. The missing freight container became the central focus of the investigation. Surveillance footage, satellite tracking, and drone flyovers were deployed across a wide area between the Pyrenees and northeastern Spain. But nothing turned up. It was as if the crate had been swallowed by the landscape. Authorities feared the cargo had already been transferred again, possibly moved to another country under forged documents. The only clue came 48 hours later, when a farmer near Lleida, Spain, reported hearing a low-flying jet in the middle of the night, followed by a brief fire in the distance. When emergency teams reached the location, they found a private jet burned out on a hidden airstrip deep in the hills, far from any commercial airport. The jet had no identifying numbers. Its tail section had been removed. The engines were scorched, but the landing gear and frame were largely intact, indicating the fire had occurred after landing. Inside the aircraft, investigators discovered parts of the same black steel crate from the freight train. It had been opened, its contents removed. The only thing left were several scorched data storage devices, tucked into the side panels of the jet's cabin. Forensic teams confirmed they were cold cryptocurrency wallets, hardened, untraceable digital storage systems designed to hold massive amounts of encrypted currency. Even in their damaged state, they held the remnants of more than $60 million in Bitcoin and Ethereum. However, the full amount stolen during the Berlin cyber heist had been nearly $90 million. That meant at least $30 million, and possibly more was still unaccounted for. There were no bodies inside the jet, no blood, no footprints. Whoever had landed the plane had escaped before the fire. Burn patterns suggested the blaze was set deliberately, possibly to erase forensic evidence. A nearby tire track led to a service road, where a vehicle had likely been waiting. The biggest surprise came from fingerprint analysis. A partial thumbprint was recovered from inside the cockpit. It matched Captain Leo Hart, the pilot who had vanished during Flight JX-103. Investigators were stunned. If Hart had been part of the operation, he had fooled everyone, his family, the airline, and global law enforcement. But it was also possible that he had been coerced, forced to participate under threat. There was no ransom demand, no manifesto, and still no sign of Victor Romano, the gangster who had also disappeared during the original flight. Further analysis revealed that the jet had taken off from a small, decommissioned military airstrip in northern Spain, roughly 150 kilometers from the train track. That airstrip had no active record, but infrared imaging confirmed recent use. It appeared the freight crate had been loaded from the train onto a vehicle, driven to the airstrip and transferred into the jet before takeoff. What remained unclear was where the jet had originally intended to go and why it never made it. The operation had been executed with military-like timing. 3 transport systems had been used: a commercial jet, freight train, and a private aircraft, all in the span of 24 hours. The missing money, missing people, and missing pieces were part of something far larger than a heist. This was a full-scale extraction mission, carried out in silence and covered in smoke. As the weeks passed, the trail grew colder. International investigators from Europol and Interpol, pooled resources to track any movement connected to Victor Romano, the vanished freight container, or Captain Leo Hart. No digital footprints emerged, bank accounts remained untouched, burner phones went silent, and no international border crossings matched their profiles. It was as if the central players had evaporated into thin air. Then, a break came from an unexpected place. A travel blogger from Argentina posted a scenic photo on a coastal dock in a remote Chilean fishing village. In the background of the image, barely visible, stood a man with short dark hair wearing sunglasses, handing over a small metal case to another man dressed in aviation gear. Facial recognition software flagged the image within hours. The man closely resembled Victor Romano. The other figure was never identified, but the aviation badge on his uniform traced back to a long-defunct South African charter company, one that had been used in the past for off-the-books extractions of high-value individuals. Investigators believed this image, though blurry, was the final piece of the puzzle. Victor Romano had made it out. Not only had he managed to flee Europe with tens of millions in stolen assets, but he had also orchestrated a high-risk, multi-country extraction involving false identities, corrupted airline staff, a hijacked commercial flight, an unscheduled train interception, and a disappearing private jet. It was no longer just a heist. It was a blueprint for how modern criminals could bend the rules of international logistics and transport to vanish without consequence. Attention turned again to Captain Leo Hart. His wife, Emily, had remained silent throughout the investigation. But 6 weeks after the incident, she contacted local authorities to report a package left outside her apartment door. Inside was a one-way airline ticket to Buenos Aires, issued in her name, and a note printed in block letters. "Don't wait." There was no return address, no sender name. Emily disappeared the following morning. Her phone was switched off, and CCTV footage showed her entering the airport alone, carrying only a backpack. She was never seen again. Some experts now believe Leo Hart may have been the key architect of the operation, not a pawn. His flying skills, clean background, and respected position gave him perfect cover. If he had faked his disappearance, he had done so flawlessly. Others argued he was manipulated, offered a deal he couldn't refuse, or threatened into cooperation to protect his family. Either way, Hart's fingerprint on the crashed jet tied him directly to the mission's execution. To this day, no formal charges have been brought. The identities of the masked men seen unloading the crate remain unknown. The missing container was never found. Of the $90 million stolen in the cyber heist, only a fraction has been recovered. Authorities have called it one of the most sophisticated disappearances in modern criminal history. Some believe Romano is living under a new identity in South America. Others think he never made it out, and that the image on the dock was just another misdirection. But one truth remains. A commercial jet landed on train tracks in broad daylight, and the world still doesn't know exactly why.